talk. Embrace the hate. Yeah, see? Rereading Elon Musk as a chicken shit heel. I was most excited. Yes, because yes, I agree. But I'll shut up and I'll let kick it over to you guys.
All right, let's do this. Can everyone see okay? All right, wonderful. So, yes, that is the title of our presentation. Just a quick introduction. My name is Marek Muller. I'm an assistant professor of communication studies at Texas State. My co-presenter is Cecilia Cerja, an assistant professor of politics of women's studies at the University of the South. We are not professional wrestling scholars, but we are professional wrestling superfans. So we were so excited at the opportunity to pivot from everything we normally do to give this presentation. We hope that you enjoy. And Cecilia, why don't you kick us off?
Can do. So I know we all remember the epic moment in which Kane told John Cena to embrace the hate, and how John Cena had turned on his best friend. And John Cena in 2012 decided to not embrace the hate and very much stay the face. But now we see in 2025, John Cena has embraced the hate and the fans are still cheering for him, right? And so we thought this was an interesting opportunity to talk about heels and how much praise they get from the audience and Elon Musk as a chicken shit heel. Next slide. So we have a couple propositions in this particular presentation. One, obviously, since the second Trump presidency is new, a lot of the stuff that exists on the KFAB presidency is only contextualized to the first administration. And so we want to say there are actually some very interesting dynamics happening in the second administration in terms of narratives, especially when we think about our favorite special government employee, Elon Musk, right? And so when we think about some of Musk's storylines as a billionaire, as an amazing CEO, as someone who's going to slash the budget by trillions, right? We can see these sort of purposeful and less than purposeful invocations of the heel archetype. And Musk often presents himself as the cool heel, right? Which we'll get into a little bit later. But when we look at what his actions end up exemplifying, it's often that he is the chicken shit heel being saved from someone else. And so later, Merrick will talk about the oppositional reading of Musk's rhetoric as a chicken shit heel and how we can potentially use ethos demolition, just like we do with every other heel, in order to defeat some of the power that Musk has. Next slide. So, when we're situating the Trump administration, right, we have to remember, right, what this presidency is telling us and how it draws from wrestling. And I think one of the clearest ways we can see that is when we talk about Trump's rhetorical appeals, right? He often is using very clear storylines of who is the enemy. So, as our lovely keynote mentioned, right, in his first run on the campaign trail, he largely saw Hillary Clinton as the enemy, right? And but her emails, and we needed to drain the swamp, right? He often has very antagonistic rhetoric against immigrants in the same way. And these are little snippets that his followers, fans, supporters can draw on and keep regurgitating and scream back at him at these various events and rallies that he is hosting, right? And we see that it's like a meta theoretical play because anytime someone fact checks him, right, he pretends that it doesn't exist or goes back to one of those previous storylines, refusing to break, the fourth wall or have any illusion this is nothing but authentic. So the research gap we're trying to fill is using the scholarship from the first administration to apply it to the second administration with a new character and a new storyline, Elon Musk. And so archetypes, right, are sort of the community's collective understanding and symbolism central to the community. So for Trump, right, one of the major ways that they know that they are a part of this and the narrative keeps appearing is when they say that they are part of the MAGA cult, right, or wearing the red hat. And the way that he describes the world is the way that they describe the world, even if we know that that is not actually reality, right? And so it sort of describes the type of actions they should take, the type of political investments that they have, and how they conceptualize the world around him. And he's fundamentally changing the way that they see reality. And so we're going to look into some of that symbolism in terms of Elon Musk.
So as we look into this idea of archetype, largely what Cecilia and I are drawing from is this thing in rhetorical studies called narrative criticism, which suggests that far from narrative simply being something that occurs in fiction, human beings exist largely through the telling of stories, and stories help us understand the way that we exist in the world, what we should expect from the world, how things work in the world according to stories and characters that are repeated over and over and over again. So naturally, it's important, if we do consider this to be a KFAB presidency, to take a look at what potential wrestling archetypes are made manifest in the administration. So obviously, if we were to go back into the most basic of basic wrestling archetypes, we have the two types of characters, the face and the heel, where the face is generally the good guy. We understand the face is not going to use generally dirty tactics. The face is generally going to praise the audience rather than try to drive them away. The face is going to attempt to build solidarity with the people around them and ultimately fight for good and justice. Whereas the heel is very likely to try to antagonize the audience, very likely to use less than noble tactics, is very likely to just not be the person that you are supposed to want to emulate. If a face goes over the heel, this is good. If a heel goes over the face, this is bad. And we learn life lessons about who should win in any given moment and how we should feel about it based upon their actions. But of course, within any archetype, we can find sub-archetypes because there is not just one type of face. There is not just one type of heel. And for the purposes of our presentation, what we are concerned with are very specific sub-archetypical structures of heels. So we have different types that we see. The monster heel, the heel that constantly just rolls over everything in his path. The authority heel, the heel who just has way too much power. The foreign heel, who, oh my goodness, we've seen some pretty unfortunate representations of the foreign heel, as we can see here with the Iron Sheik. And then, of course, the two we really want to talk about today, the cool heel and the chicken shit heel. Now, obviously, given the complexity of narrative structures, you don't just have to be the monster, the foreign, the chicken shit. One could argue, for example, that Rusev or Gunther are currently amalgamations of both the monster and the foreign, or that potentially, well, no, that's probably the best example that I have. But generally speaking, what we are very concerned with are two heel sub-archetypes that generally run on the opposite ends of the structure. The cool versus the chicken shit. Because the archetypic structure of the cool heel is sort of the heel that we love hating. The heel that is just really, really cool and is almost so cool that, at least to the smart marks, he becomes a face. He's a villain with swagger, intelligence, dark charm. He breaks the rules, but in a way that's stylish or witty, making them super compelling to watch. Obviously, the example I give in an image is Drew McIntyre and his "I prayed for this and it happened" phase, but we could also take a look at Roman Reigns' ascension as the tribal chief. They are the antagonist, but they blur the line of face and heel. Not quite in the way that a tweener does, but enough that you still cheer them while you boo them. They can steal the focus from the hero, almost make the heel look boring, and shift the narrative weight just through their sheer amazing presence. And yes, they're booed in storyline, but they're often cheered in reality, on the message boards, or even at the pay-per-views where the super fans show up. Fans admire them for their performance, for their confidence, their mic skills, for their look. They are fan favorites despite their bad behavior. And oftentimes, the big running joke is, "Why are you booing me? I'm right."
And so we see Elon Musk leaning into this particular archetype, right? And so when we think about him, right, he's a very cool person, right? And there are even rumors that he has his Twitter employees sign an affidavit saying that he is cool. Right? To ensure that everyone knows he's the coolest, right? And we see that like he plays video games, and what other CEO do you know that plays video games? Or, he's dating Grimes, or he's in the Oval Office, right? And so when we see him leaning into this archetype, right, he is defeating the woke mind virus, and we see this in all the ways they sort of have attacked DEI, right? He says the unpopular thing, right, that nobody wants to say, and that's what makes him even cooler. And yes, he may hurt people, but he does have a reason, right? These layoffs have meaning, right? We're going to save trillions. And he's just a misunderstood genius gamer tech bro, that if you don't like him, it's because you don't understand him. Because if you were really in on it, you would sort of see what is happening.
And on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the archetypic structure of the chicken shit heel. You'll see that I have the gif of Dominic Mysterio and Rhea Ripley, because for the last few years, the absolute mecca chicken shit has been Dominic Mysterio, the boastful coward who cuts arrogant promos but backs down the second he's confronted, the scheming escapist who avoids combat through things like stalling, feign injury, trickery, or you call in the Judgment Day for some cheating, for some distractions, or for some 4-on-1 action. They hide behind authority figures, or the stronger figures, or in this case, Rhea Ripley, or their factions, the Judgment Day. Stronger allies who really are able to shadow the fact that this chicken shit heel is not actually as tough and unstoppable as he likes to present. But when finally caught in a fair fight and defeated, oh, he is exposed for the absolute chicken shit loser that he is. So the narrative function here is largely premised on this idea of audience catharsis. Because as a boastful coward, there's a dramatic irony. Fans know this heel is not cool, and they want to expose the fraud, which leads to a building of tension and largely contempt. The audience sees through this cowardice that's disguised as strategy, fueling across the storyline a sense of resentment, amplifying a desire for justice and underdog triumph, such that when Dominic Mysterio is finally defeated, the audience erupts in joy as balance is restored, because Dominic, or whoever the chicken shit is simply so hated, so chicken shit, that even every time he opens his mouth, he is drowned out with booze. So, an oppositional reading, and by oppositional reading, we are not suggesting that we have identified the actual reality, that there is only one true way to understand Elon Musk. What we are suggesting is that at any given moment, as critics, we have an opportunity to provide a critique of power, to provide a critique of who is in charge. And so in doing so, what we are trying to do is say, well, what if we read Elon Musk as this alternative archetype? What if we took a look at the fact that despite presenting himself as the amazing CEO, the Tony Stark, the self-made man, he was born into privilege amidst one of the most evil institutions in the world, apartheid? What if we looked at him as defended by the authority, much in the same way Seth Rollins was protected by Triple H after turning on the Shield? He's protected through government funding. He's protected by being able to leverage the power of the Trump administration to avoid accountability. What if we took a look at the fact that all too often his mother actually steps in media or social media to defend him when people are mean to him? Or the fact that he literally challenged Mark Zuckerberg to a fight. Zuckerberg agreed, and then Musk sort of let that not happen when he realized it was a bad plan. Current readings of Tesla numbers or Doge stats suggest that he actually fudges numbers and data to look way more successful or competent than he actually is. And he has a tendency to sulk publicly when criticized, as we can see with this very viral tweet that went forward when he was getting a little too much criticism of his life.
And so, what Macaro in critical rhetoric calls us to do is not just to identify these narratives or to identify these power structures, but to move beyond critique about a what do and articulate some of the possibilities that can exist. And so just like with every heel, right, we think in particular this like ethos demolition of Elon Musk that we see happening right now in terms of his Tesla numbers and having to back away from the White House is a pretty clear example of some of the political possibilities we can have to sort of take the power back from this KFAB presidency and the narratives that they are spinning. Next slide.
So if we take this KFAB presidency seriously, and we take the world of KFAB and wrestling politics seriously, what would it mean then if we interpret Musk as a chicken shit heel to quote unquote defeat him? And obviously, defeat here does not mean literally he is pinned 1, 2, 3, but it would mean, what does it mean in the political arena to take someone down? Well, for a chicken shit, Musk's marks need a reason to stop marking out for him. Musk's opposition need that sense of catharsis that comes when the chicken shit is exposed as chicken shit and not cool. Musk needs to be exposed as fraudulent, contra to his self-presentation. In other words, we envision this as ethos demolition, where ethos is a rhetorical term that refers to the credibility, the character of the speaker. And demolition here would refer to the destruction of a rhetor's credibility through specifically the acts of humiliation, of exposure, of fraudulence, through strategic and purposeful goading of the rhetor to act contra to his derived ethos, where derived in this sense means the actual character that the rhetor is attempting to put forward. And there are multiple examples of this that have already happened. But to be clear, this is always going to be an ongoing process. It's impermanent, and it's not always going to be traditionally political. But there was a moment during the height of the election where Musk was exposed as a cheater at video games. And this seems like nothing, but boy, it gave some of his gamer marks a reason to stop marking out. And it was pretty obvious that Musk did not like being accused of being a cheater and actively took steps to try to punish the people who exposed him. Musk's baby mamas have called him out and are still calling him out on social media in a manner that is reshared, remocked, and obviously is not super something you would want as a super powerful government figure to be shared all over social media. But that causes catharsis for those who are really struggling under this current administration. And of course, there's the more traditional political call out, losing the Wisconsin Supreme Court election despite pouring $20 million into it, exposing him to some extent as a fraudulent rich man and politician who is actually not able to influence as much as we might like to think.
And so just to sort of wrap up, we really love the idea of using these narrative archetypes to understand, right, the current iteration of the KFAB presidency and some of the new characters that we're seeing, these new storylines, these new positions, and thinking about how we can use this narrative structure to sort of understand and call out these power structures, and in particular, Elon Musk, right, using ethos demolition as a way to sort of take back the power from the chicken shit heel and prove that he's not a cool heel at all. Thank you all so very much for this lovely presentation or for being here at this lovely conference. And we can't wait to hear what everyone else has to say.
Yeah.
And if anybody wants this presentation, we do have our scholarship cited here.
Yes.
I'm sure.
Perfect. Yes, thank you. We probably, certainly want to be able to, follow up with this and everything. We will allow questions after a couple more presentations. Tyler, you're in here. Where you at? There you are. What's happening, friend?
Hey, how are you?
Super. What do we got here? What we choose to remember and what they choose to forget. The WWE Hall of Fame and the propaganda of memory. Ooh, yeah, I'm getting some of the Shannon tips and vibes in there too, in terms of, selective memory and all that jazz. You have a deck, yes?
No, I do not. I
Oh.
just have a paper I'm going to read out if that's all right.
Yeah, let me do some of that and kick it off.
Okay, cool. Take it away. Awesome. Thank you. So, thanks everyone. Greetings from Canada. And thanks in advance for your listening and consideration. I invite any feedback on this. This is sort of just some new thoughts that I had over the past month or so with the lead up to the WWE Hall of Fame ceremony, WrestleMania weekend, etc. All right. If professional wrestling is, as Barth's off-cited quotation states, really a spectacle of excess, then there's no time and place more evident for this spectacle than WrestleMania weekend. Starting off WrestleMania weekend at the very odd time of 1 a.m. in the morning, overnight, Friday to Saturday, was the WWE's annual Hall of Fame ceremony. A presented recognition of the past, the WWE's Hall of Fame inducts professional wrestling legends into its non-existent halls each spring. But is this Hall of Fame truly a representation of professional wrestling's history? Or is it just another event to sell tickets, to build up the WWE's business, and exploit past practitioners of the sport for its own propaganda machine? By speaking to each of this year's inductees, this brief presentation will consider whether the WWE Hall of Fame truly is an accurate representation of professional wrestling history, in order to critique the ways in which this ceremony rewrites and renegotiates the problematic history of the WWE, its wrestlers, and the art form itself for its capitalistic purposes. This essay functions mostly as a simple critique of the WWE Hall of Fame as it currently exists. I invite suggestions for theoretical or methodological approaches to future work on this topic, particularly as it relates to memory and nostalgia as a form of propaganda. So, as previously noted, the WWE Hall of Fame ceremony was held in the wee hours of the morning, starting at 1 a.m. on Saturday, April 19th. This year's Hall of Fame inductees include the current head of creative for the company, a recently redeemed but publicly judged to be murderer, a female wrestling legend inducted by her husband, a nostalgic tag team with fat-phobic connotations, and one of the best matches of all time. This varied list of inductees, and my somewhat tongue-in-cheek way of listing them here, indicate quite clearly that the WWE Hall of Fame is a wide-ranging space. That being said, each of these inductees also represent some shaky ground for discussion of whether their induction into the Hall of Fame is based purely on merit, or if redemption, political behind-the-scenes deal-making, company profits, company loyalty, or any of combination of these things are actually what's doing the work. This essay will discuss each of last week's inductees into the Hall of Fame based on these aforementioned grounds. Then, by comparing these most recent inductees to inductees of the past, to consider whether the WWE's Hall of Fame is actually constructed as a testament to the true history and glorification of professional wrestling, or if it's just another somewhat exploitative attempt by the company to monopolize and then further exploit its own workers for the profits of company shareholders and the like. Now, the first category that I've identified, which might be the most seemingly innocuous, is still laden with company directives. Throughout the Hall of Fame's existence, particular wrestlers, personalities, managers have been inducted due to their large dedication to the WWE itself, rather than as a representation of the art form as a whole. This isn't a crazy idea, but one that, despite WWE's illusions and many fan assumptions, shows that the WWE Hall of Fame isn't a memorial to professional wrestling itself, but to the very specific history of the WWE. Inductees such as Gorilla Monsoon, Pat Patterson, Vincent J. McMahon, VKM's father, are important personalities to the history of wrestling as a whole, sure. But being that they are, some of the first inductees into the Hall of Fame over its first 5 years, shows that there's always been a sort of privileging of WWF, WE personalities. Past WWF champions and behind-the-scenes legends always seem to be some of the first inducted members into the Hall of Fame, which means there's always a particular emphasis on the dedication to the company itself. It is not necessarily the fact that WWE privileges its own figures within their Hall of Fame that is problematic, but also the way in which other figures within the history of professional wrestling have been diminished due to their ability to be less monetized. This is probably the most evident in the WWE's legacy wing, where less marketable figures can be inducted into the Hall of Fame as a sort of performative procedure, but are not given extensive coverage as to their actual influence on the industry more broadly. As Dave Meltzer has criticized, this is the category they, the WWE, use to honor people who, for whatever reason, they don't feel are marketable names to the modern audience. With names such as Ed Strangler Lewis, Frank Gotch, George Hackenschmidt, Lou Thez, and Mildred Burke being amongst them. Induction into these Hall of Fames across different sports and art forms is often not linear chronologically, but one would think that the actual people who have laid the groundwork to define and create the sport and art form should get more recognition than just a simple listing of names adjacent to the ceremony itself. Now, the next name and category that I'd like to discuss is related to Michelle McCool. I don't want to imply here that she doesn't deserve to be in a wrestling Hall of Fame, but there is something quite odd about her induction into the Hall of Fame by her husband. I can't help but feel like maybe there's some political stuff going on. I mean, if The Undertaker pushes to have his wife in the Hall of Fame, who's going to say no? I find it particularly uh, nefarious considering that China still isn't in the Hall of Fame as an individual wrestler, despite her being one of the first wrestlers to be taken seriously as an independent competitor in the presence, especially in the era she came in, which was a particularly, masculine driven and misogynistic era of the WWE. But due to some of her problematic public issues, her omission from the Hall of Fame seems to have a somewhat clear reasoning from the company's perspective. This brings us to the next category of identification, which is the WWE Hall of Fame's propensity for the privileging the redemption story, with its alternative of those being at odds with the company due to their outside behavior or association with rival promotions kind of being cast aside. This year's candidate for this portion would be Lex Luger, having previously received a lot of blame for the death of Miss Elizabeth. However, after recent acknowledgement of his partial fault in her death due to their addictions and a physical rehabilitation alongside DDP and his yoga company, the company WWE obviously saw both of these things as an opportunity for them to co-opt one man's personal journey towards redemption for their own purposes. And if this may seem a little bit skeptical of their intentions, I think what drives home this point is that, in the context, is their inability to allow or procure Sting, maybe the wrestler most attached to his career, in the WCW at the very least. While reports differ as to the particular reason why they couldn't get him, it has been reported that the WWE did not even reach out to see if this was a possibility. Furthermore, despite Paul Heyman's induction into the Hall of Fame last year, it seems that many ECW wrestlers, a promotion from which many ideas for the Attitude Era itself were borrowed, do not make it into the Hall of Fame unless, of course, they have also been a significant part of the WWE's past. I can only conjecture that this might be due to the fact that in giving credit to performers from this promotion, WWE might also have to admit that not every idea that they ever come up with was their own. Some wrestlers that have meant a lot to professional wrestling more broadly from this promotion include Sabu, Tommy Dreamer, The Sandman, and Shane Douglas. This is all to say that the specific reason some names go into the Hall of Fame before or over others is unclear. What is clear, however, is that those who get inducted offer something to the company through their marketability or for the purposes of financial or economic benefits. I think it would be an interesting study, if possible, to see how much merch sales increase for these figures that are inducted in a given year. Although I'm not sure how easily you could hone in on merch statistics for particular names. The next category is related to the natural disasters induction. While Fred Ottman, Typhoon, is still alive, I find posthumous inductions particularly objectionable, considering that the very first Hall of Fame ceremony occurred only 2 months following the death of Andre the Giant. To put it plainly, inducting somebody into a Hall of Fame after they've died is a particularly shitty way of co-opting the person's death for company purposes, without giving them flowers while the person in question is still alive to receive them. Another historical example of this is the way that the WWE co-opted the Ultimate Warrior's death following his induction, whereby following his acrimonious split from the company, the WWE made sure to make an award in his honor. Despite his ostracization from the company for nearly 20 years prior, the WWE were quick to jump on this opportunity to utilize his own name for their purposes. This year, a new official type of induction was introduced in the gamut of things, which was the matches being inducted. While it isn't, yeah, the WWE's begin to choose in specific matches to be inducted to the Hall of Fame. While I personally feel like there are a few better matches to be the first induction for this category, this choice to add another category to the list of potential ways individuals can be inducted seems like a suspicious tactic to continue to garner fan support. Although it isn't far-fetched to realize that the WWE's propensity for multi-induction might be simply related to their fascination for breaking records. I mean, one can hear them saying, and now four-time Hall of Fame inductee Bret the Hitman Hart, as a way of stirring up fan fervor. So, I spent most of this essay just critiquing how the WWE operates as Hall of Fame. What would be the solution of a better way to operate such an entity? I know that it would be very rare for a company as large and as connected to the entertainment and sports industry to not operate such a thing. I mean, all of the major sports leagues have their halls of fame, so why not the WWF? What I think could be particularly useful in making the process of induction more transparent is some sort of explanation of the reasoning for why certain inductees get inducted each year. It would be useful to know what their criteria is for induction, or whether it is truly just an arbitrary process or one that just comes as names sort of reveal themselves as worthy to the company. I think maybe also giving fans a say into who gets inducted would be useful. Fan polls or voting would also potentially allow for a more varied representation of those inducted into the Hall of Fame. Also, and of course, giving equal time to individuals from the annals and margins of professional wrestling history would be incredibly beneficial for a more robust representation within this particular entity. Finally, just as a final example of a particularly unique stance of someone who didn't want to get, who hasn't been inducted to the Hall of Fame, I'd like to just talk about Owen Hart. Related to his death and with the WWE, Owen Hart's wife, Martha, has publicly stated that while she's forgiven WWE, she'll never allow him to be inducted into their Hall of Fame. At the end of the day, this is a brave stance, but also what I think is the correct one. Whether or not the WWE is responsible for Owen's death specifically, or if it was the harness maker, the back and forth between the company and his estate is a little bit over the top from WWE's perspective, at least. But the WWE, and particularly Vince's decision to continue the show after his death, is the one that resonates in Martha's decision to not allow Owen's legacy to be used as just another marketing ploy and tactic for company profit. Her refusal to succumb to the company's motivations and insistence on upholding her own ethical code, while somewhat of a necessity, is also an aspirational choice. If only the WWE would privilege a bit more of this type of ethical consideration as to their operation of their own Hall of Fame, and not put profits over people. While I do think that there is a place for a Hall of Fame within the company, having a bit more consideration into the optics of certain choices or exclusions would be beneficial, as that to not exploit the already exploited wrestlers of the past. I am also aware that sometimes offering up potential solutions to these type of business issues might actually be beneficial for a company, so maybe this short essay should have been plainly more critical. That being said, I hope that this essay has offered just a brief overview of the problem addicts associated with the Hall of Fame as it currently exists, and I welcome criticism, critiques, suggestions for further work on this topic. I know that this presentation hasn't been particularly academic, with no theoretical basis, but I did want to get something out there regarding this somewhat niche element of the professional wrestling space. Furthermore, I hope that this essay has been useful in summarizing at least some of the issues with the WWE Hall of Fame. I probably missed names and particular scenarios where some of these issues could be further illuminated, but I hope to continue work on this topic, adding in some theoretical stuff in the future and further critiquing this particular thing, because I wanted to bring some of these critiques out of the space in which it's most often seen, where I see a lot of the online wrestling community critiquing this, and I think there's room for it in academia. And
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, these types of critical critiques and criticism, I think, is what illuminates and starts to reveal, the interdisciplinary stuff and exposing some of these layers that do now start to go into how humans are persuaded, the selective memory, like the reasoning, the values, motivation into wanting to do something or exploit something, right? And I know we've been going off in the chat, about all kind of topics and support for China and everything. And I'm, was thinking about, okay, well, what might have been in Martha's hearts or, Owen's wife about like allowing AEW to have the Owen Cup, right?
Yeah.
It's like, what does that say? What message is that,
Absolutely.
Yeah, we'll certainly, I think, have some time for some Q&A after this, but Adam, I know you're in here. Where are you? Hey, I see your name. Hi.
Hey, I'm ready to go.
Awesome. Do you have a presentation? You want to share your screen or anything? Oh, you already are. Let me just shut it right up. Go ahead, take it away.
Yep, are the slides visible then?
Yep.
Visible and legible, great. Okay, thanks to Nisha. Yeah, my name is Adam Dinsmore. I'm a sociologist at the University of York in the UK. But more importantly, I'm also a wrestling fan and have been for over 25 years. And I'm going to speak about the unique position of the audience within professional wrestling, which I characterize as semi-fictional. So as a wrestling fan, I've often been asked one question, which maybe other people on the call have had similar experiences. And that question is why? So that's why do you continue to find wrestling so compelling so many years after one is supposed to have grown out of it? And this paper arose from my attempts at answering that question, which has sometimes been asked by people who think that in enjoying wrestling, I have somehow become confused about the status of reality versus fiction. And in fact, I want to argue that the relationship between reality and fiction posited by wrestling is more complex than is often assumed, and that this accounts for wrestling's apparently puzzling and persistent appeal. So wrestling can be thought of as a combination of sport, theater, and soap opera. But it's distinguished by the unusually active role that the audience plays in the narratives acted out by its performers. Such that the audience can be considered a semi-fictional character in the show. That is, a character who can be conceived as real and or fictional without contradiction. And I'll argue that this unique position allows for a set of fan practices that are not possible in other cultural forms that position its audience with one foot in fiction and one in reality. And my argument consists of 4 propositions. So because the audience is written into its fictive universe, wrestling is greater than the sum of its parts. The audience occupies a liminal space between reality and fiction, because wrestlers, that's both the performers and the characters that they play, are aware of their presence and can talk back without breaking character. Where other fictions break the fourth wall, wrestling therefore has no fourth wall to break, which means that wrestling narratives emerge from interactions between real and fictional people and are therefore more entwined with reality than other types of fiction. So in this presentation, I'm first going to unpack what I mean by the wrestling audience's semi-fictional role. I'll then draw comparisons to participatory audience practices in other cultural forms and explain why, despite similarities, I don't count them as semi-fictional. And I'll then offer a short summary and we can get going with the Q&A. So wrestling semi-fictional audience. So on the most recent episode of Monday Night Raw, John Cena, whose 20-year career is among the clearest examples of the wrestling audience's semi-fictional role, told the fans in attendance that you people do not write history. And this was a statement made by John Cena, the character, but John Cena, the performer, maybe more than anyone else, is well aware that in wrestling, nothing could be further from the truth. Wrestling history is replete with examples where the audience has intervened to steer the narrative being told by the performers in a different direction than that intended by the writers. And some of those are on screen now. And although these instances seem to occur more regularly over the last sort of 15 to 20 years, as fans have arguably become more self-aware of their role, they have been a feature of wrestling right throughout its history and all over the world. So I've got some historical and some international examples on the screen now too. And this is because, despite appearances, wrestling matches are not solely constructed by the wrestlers and the referees that we conventionally think of as the performers. But in Deleuzean terms, wrestling narratives emerge from an assemblage that also includes the audience and their reactions to goings-on in the ring. And this constitutes a rather unique collaboration between real and fictional people. So the characters played by wrestlers only exist in as much as any character portrayed by an actor. But audience members are not fictional. They're real people who, whether we situate them in reality or wrestling's fictive universe, have attended the show to cheer their favorites and boo the villains, at least in theory. Yet the two construct the narratives that are told during and between wrestling matches. And so by most definitions, the audience's participatory role qualifies wrestling as an example of postmodern entertainment in which some characters, so the members of the audience, are aware that they are participating in a fiction. However, although the wrestling audience's semi-fictional role is arguably a postmodern construction, it predates the time period we conventionally associate with postmodernism, which is typically said to have begun in the 1960s and 70s. So going back to the 1930s, the first publication issued by the Mass Observation Archive, which was an initiative in the UK that began in the 1930s, where ordinary people were asked to submit observations of everyday life for analysis by social scientists, features a chapter on observations made by ordinary people on professional wrestling as it was performed in the English town of Bolton in the 1930s. And even here, there are clear signs that the audience is both aware that wrestling is fictional and that they are active participants in the fiction itself. So among 100 patrons who were asked why they enjoyed freestyle wrestling, the most popular answer, rather than strength or skill or any other virtue that we would attribute to a legitimate sporting contest, was humor. And among those who claim not to enjoy wrestling, the most common criticism was that it was not a proper sport because it was staged, faked, and in their opinion, less than a play the game affair. So the quotes on screen now come from some of those patrons who were interviewed for the book. And they suggest an awareness that the wrestlers are in some sense acting. And moreover, they see the crowd's involvement as integral to the production of the wrestling match, noting that the establishment of favorites and villains are essential to the contest going smoothly, and that the crowd's displeasure often results in a change to the performance, for instance, in the replacement of a referee for disqualifying a fan favorite. And even then, if the fight got too slow or too boring, the audience responded by singing popular songs of the time in order to signal to the performers that something had to change. And one observer notes that the possibility of the audience expressing itself was thus integral to the function of the match. He's already been mentioned a couple of times, but Roland Barthes, too, writing in the 1950s, was well aware of wrestling's fictional nature. But he did not believe that the audience were dupes, as others in the Parisian intelligentsia of the time tended to do. Rather, Barthes argued that the wrestling spectator does not wish for the actual suffering of the contestant. He only enjoys the perfection of an iconography. Crucially, for my argument, Barthes was impressed by how the audience spontaneously attunes itself to the fictional nature of a wrestling contest, more like the audience at a suburban cinema than a sporting event. And he argued that there's no more problem of truth in wrestling than in the theatre. In both cases, what is expected is the representation of moral situations which are usually private. So whenever you see a think piece refer to a wrestling match as a crude example of a morality play, you can be sure they've been directly or indirectly influenced by Barthes' writing on wrestling semiotics. And so these historical examples attest to the fact that wrestling's audience has played a semi-fictional role right throughout its history. And this was made really clear in recent years during the COVID-19 pandemic, which revealed just how integral the audience was, not just to the presentation, but to the construction of wrestling's fictive universe. Other forms of entertainment like sport and theatre were also forced to adapt to the absence of an audience during the pandemic, which meant that we saw canned crowd noise used to enliven live sporting broadcasts during the period. And many theatres switched up their arrangements to cater to online audiences only. But no other cultural form went to the same length as wrestling to simulate the presence of a live audience. So WWE constructed their remarkable Thunderdome facility, where the TV audience could see live reactions from several hundred fans watching via webcam. And this didn't just happen in WWE. In AEW, the solution was more low-tech by comparison, as they chose to allow a small number of trainee wrestlers in the ringside area during matches to react to the goings-on in the ring. Neither solution was particularly effective, though, as in both cases, the audience was effectively rendered not just partly, but entirely fictional. Although the webcams genuinely showed live reactions from real fans, WWE, like sports broadcasts of the period, continued to use canned noise rather than live audio from the viewers on the webcams. And the AEW trainees were part of AEW, they were part of the production. So they were under orders to react to the matches in accordance with the performers' intentions. So neither solution was able to successfully simulate wrestling's semi-fictional audience with one foot in reality and one in fiction, which led to an extremely sterile product that few fans are keen to revisit. Now, it might be objected that audiences of other cultural forms also play an active role in narrative construction, and this is, of course, true. And however, I want to argue that few rise to the standard of a semi-fictional character that I'm using in this paper. So this section examines some of those other forms and considers how and why their audiences occupy distinct subject positions to that of the wrestling audience. So I begin by comparing wrestling to its constituent parts, sports, soap opera, and theatre, and asking how each one typically positions the audience with respect to fiction and reality. So as I've argued, in wrestling, performers and audience occupy a single space that straddles the line between fiction and reality. And interestingly, this works both ways, so that developments in reality are felt in wrestling's fictional world. So WWE Hall of Famer Donald Trump was never the president on House of Cards, but he is the president in WWE. And indeed, WWE recently wrote Trump's renaming of the Gulf of Mexico into a storyline involving Chad Gable. In sport, performers and audience also occupy a single space, but it does not ordinarily intrude into fiction. Both the contest and its audience exist solely within reality. Things get quite different in soap opera, where the worlds occupied by performers and audience are completely separate and mediated through the television screen. Although they might have a chance to interact with the actors, it's not possible for an audience member ever to interact directly with the fictional characters that they portray in soap opera, as sometimes happens in professional wrestling. Indeed, as constantly happens in professional wrestling when there's a live audience present. It's similar in the theatre, although a little more ambiguous. So here the performers and audience occupy the same physical space, but not the same narrative space. An audience member might heckle performers, but unlike in wrestling, the performer could only acknowledge the heckle if they were prepared to break character. And so we can think of the spaces that separate performer and audience in these different modalities as the fabled fourth wall that stops real life from intruding on their fictive universes. However, in wrestling, there basically is no space between performer and audience in which a fourth wall might be constructed. So drawing on Bart, drawing on mass observation and the comparisons to these other cultural forms that share some similarities with wrestling, I propose that wrestling's semi-fictional audience emerge from these 5 characteristics. So one is that there is no fourth wall. Real and fictional characters occupy the same narrative space and they interact with each other directly. 2, the narrative of the show is therefore co-constructed by writers, performers, and audience, and there is no guarantee that the 3 parties will agree on the best direction for the show. 3, as Bart observed, the audience spontaneously attunes itself to its semi-fictional role in wrestling without the need for writers or performers to explicitly smarten them up. 4th, interactions between audience and performer are instant, occurring while the performance is in progress. And this means that owing to the live nature of most wrestling broadcasts, the live audience response become a part of the show's canon, whether the writers and performers want them to or not, which means that the audience's response is consequential for future broadcasts, precluding the possibility of a sitcom-style reset the following week where everything goes back to the way that the writers intended. Crucially, none of these individual features are unique to wrestling, but wrestling tends to be the only cultural form where all 5 of these characteristics apply simultaneously. And we can see this clearly when we examine other audience practices, which might be participatory, but lacking one or more of the 5 aspects I've just discussed, cannot be considered semi-fictional. So for instance, in ancient Greek theatre, often featured a chorus who observed the story being told and summarized developments and character motivations for the paying audience. However, like the trainees who spectated at AEW's COVID-era shows, the chorus were ultimately part of the production. Their interventions were perhaps instant and consequential, but there was nothing spontaneous about them, as they were, a planned part of the show. And the fourth wall between reality and fiction therefore remains intact. Another example from soap opera and other televised narratives is the phenomenon of fan service, that's on-screen developments that are prompted by the viewing audience's response to earlier episodes. So a famous example that I've used on the slide here is Bobby Ewing from Dallas, who came back from the dead following a fan backlash, as it was revealed that the months of storyline centering around Bobby's murder had all been a dream. This is a co-constructed narrative of a sort, but it does not involve direct interaction between real and fictional characters like we see in wrestling. Instead, fan service tends to be mediated through word of mouth, reportage, and in the present day through social media, such that there's no break incurred by the fourth wall. Moreover, the audience feedback does not occur instantly during the performance, but can take months or years to filter through. And finally, a really interesting example is immersive theatre. So I'm talking here about theatrical performances where the audience are given an active role by the production. So an example might include a performance of The Great Gatsby, where audience members are asked to dress up in period dress and play the role of the attendees at Gatsby's parties. And this probably comes closest to the semi-fictional role of the wrestling audience. Unlike the other examples we considered, immersive theatre succeeds in abolishing the fourth wall, as wrestling does, allowing the audience to interact directly with the fictional characters in the show. And as such, the narrative of each show is to some extent co-constructed by the audience, whose input does occur instantly during the show. However, the audience input is not spontaneous in the way that Bart recognized in wrestling audiences. The audience's role is here prescribed by the production, which advertises itself as immersive, and therefore does effectively smarten the audience up. Also, the audience's actions are only consequential for the duration of a single show. Once it's over, the fictive universe typically resets itself, ready for the next performance. So in summary, I hope I've demonstrated how the wrestling audience occupies a unique position that allows for a set of fan practices that we don't see, we rarely see elsewhere, even in other participatory forms of entertainment. And those practices principally include the audience's routine and sometimes antagonistic co-construction of the wrestling narrative with the performers and writers who are conventionally considered to be the authors of the show. So returning to the 4 propositions I shared at the start, this means the wrestling audience constitutes a semi-fictional character in the show. And indeed, the fact that the wrestling audience has one foot in fiction, one in reality, means that wrestling's fictive universe is, in a sense, coextensive with the real world, with no fourth wall to separate the two. So rather than a fake sport, the unique position of the audience allows us to think of wrestling as a metafiction more intimately entwined with reality than many others. And so thanks for listening, and we can now jump to the Q&A.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you, Adam. That was awesome, man. We could talk for days. All 3 of these presentations have just been so good. So cool. We got Marek, Cecilia, Tyler, Adam still here. I'll open it up for the audience. If there's any comments or questions for any of the 3 presentations that you've just heard, I'll open it up there. Yeah, Lily.
I had like half question, half comment about the Hall of Fame presentation. Very good presentation. I just want all of them were very good. All the presentation very good. But um whenever I look at discussions about the Hall of Fame, I'm inevitably going to get pissed off because there's always a WWE centric focus, not just to the Hall of Fame, but to the discussion of the wrestlers. There's an infamous one that pissed me off about Coco Beware.
Okay.
And every time someone's, every time every time someone says something about Coco Beware, it is obvious that they have not watched his work in UWF or Memphis. And
Okay.
if you go back and watch that stuff, he's legitimately fantastic. And when people, this is just a chance for me to rant about how much I love Coco Beware. I'm realizing that now.
Valid.
Um,
Absolutely.
but my overall point was that that people seem to only consider his work in the WWE with the macaw, with whatever, I forget the name of the macaw.
Yeah.
And
Forget to.
and also beyond that, if you look at a lot of the wrestlers, it's like the only Joshi, I believe, in the Hall of Fame is Bull Nakano, who is famous.
Did we lose you?
Uh, etc.
You broke out a little bit at the end, but Tyler, do you have a quick response?
Yeah. No, I mean definitely, and that's I think is the problematic is that because they present themselves as, a professional wrestling Hall of Fame,
Yeah.
the common fan or anybody that just goes, "What's professional wrestling?" is going to think of that as, "Oh, well, these are the figures we should notice." Where, obviously it's broader. And when I'm watching stuff from the 80s, and I always want to go watch, early WCW stuff, I don't really care to watch Hulk Hogan again, really, ever.
Yeah.
So, similar thing as I saw in the group chat of like the WWE AEW stuff is like, I know a lot of people are sick of the WWE just because it's been this thing that's existed as the only real representation of pro wrestling for so long. But yeah, to the common person, to the person just tuning in as they flip channels on a Friday night, or people coming back to it now that it's on Netflix, they're gonna only look to things that are presented to them by this company as, the sort of history of all of it.
No, for sure. Melina, you gotta know from Germany, what time is it? Girl, are you in the middle of it? What day is it?
No, it's also Saturday and it's also just 7 p.m. So luckily not the middle of the night, just my Saturday night.
Right on. No better way to spend it. Good.
Yeah, I think so too, as a total nerd. Um, so I wanted to also thank everyone for their presentations, of course, and comment on Dinsmore's speech because this is like something I wrote in my bachelor's thesis recently, where I wanted to extend on this idea that performers and the audience share a space because they don't just do that like in the official media, but also in the unofficial media, like on social media. I think that's also something that has been going on in like the chat for a while now, yes. Where the performers themselves are also semi-fictional characters, of course, in there because they speak on their like fictional roles on a meta level, but in the same breath, they may say something that is kind of in line with their current feud, and where, yeah. I've come to see it in this way that wrestling constructs like a big story space where everything is kind of doubtful in its relationship to reality, and which also blurs the lines not just between reality and fiction, but also between performer and audience, just in every space that it exists. And so I just find that so fascinating.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. It's definitely a really fascinating thing about wrestling in the way that, yeah, its fictional world tends to spill out into the real world and kind of absorb the real world in a lot of ways. And it also tends to absorb a lot of the people who perform in it. So it was mentioned earlier about Trump maybe playing a role that he can't switch off anymore, that he's kind of become the character he's been trying to project. And I instantly just thought Ric Flair, who just seems to have been completely swallowed up by the character that he's played over a 40 or 50 year period, to the point that I think he would even struggle himself to find any kind of dividing line between the two. Like, he's kind of a conduit for wrestling to be reaching out into the real world, I think, in that way. But yeah, thanks very much for the comment. It is kind of an endlessly fascinating topic. And when I really stop to think about like what is it that makes wrestling so persistently compelling, I think it is this strange mix of fiction and reality, which actually functions a little differently to how one might think from the outside. But yeah, thanks for the comment.
Yeah, I loved it too. And it made me actually start thinking about when you had like the what did they call it during COVID when they had all the screens? Didn't they call it something?
Yeah, the Thunderdome.
Thunder, yeah. When UFC was still going on, I loved the fact that you could hear the coaches and you could hear them talking shit and you could hear the punches land, but there were so many people that I don't want to say didn't like it, but they questioned it from how it would affect the performance of the fighters. Like, if you could hear the other guy's coach telling him what to do, aren't you at a disadvantage? I was like, have you ever been in a fight? Because I promise, like, have you been hit? Because you're not thinking about hear somebody else's voice to try pivot to counter to counter. It's just like, but I thought it amped up the production, the broadcast, of MMA and UFC, and that and WWE, obviously very, very different. Franny, I know you had a question, and then we can take a breaky.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure. I had a question for Cecilia and Marek. I appreciated your heel discourse lens. And I guess my question is, do you think it's more effective to use ethos destruction to try to like further humiliate characters or figures that want to draw a lot of attention to themselves, or to no sell them and sit on your hands and deny them any kind of reaction?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And it goes back to a lot of questions in our discipline about platforming and deplatforming controversial speakers. I think in the case of Musk, the issue is he's so heavily mediated, to no sell doesn't really do much because he is so hypermediated and has been for years. I almost wonder if through the act of ethos demolition, what we're really trying to do is change the definition of heat that he's getting to almost a go away heat. Particularly since, he has go away heat already from those who are opposed to Trump's policies, but to get him to go away heat from more people, it seems to viscerally bother him to the extent that it's not only a victory to those who really don't like him, but it seems to actively undermine him in a way that's, it's entertaining, but it seems to be a legitimate political practice. This is a guy who does not like his character being questioned, especially when it's valid.
X-Pac heat. Cecilia, you want to jump in?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's just true is it's like at the end of the day, he still is a CEO and billionaire. So like there's a certain amount of attention that he will always have. So I think it's a little like, yes, I would love a world in which we could completely deplatform him. But right, if we could even get like tech bros to admit that he's not as cool as he think he is, that might be a major win, right? If we start to realize that signing an affidavit that your boss is cool is not actually cool, right? Or having your baby mamas call you out, right, on social media, not great. And so I think that there's just sort of an inevitability of like he will be in the media, right? Proxy his like, political standing and like social capital. But this humiliation, right, leads to a world in which he's more willing to retreat, which like is a world that we would appreciate.
Yeah, and just to close out, there was a question in the chat that was very related to this about the fact that Dominic Mysterio, as the quintessential chicken shit heel right now, got one of the loudest pops at WrestleMania when he won. It was earned. It was earned after years where he had legitimate go away heat prior to his heel turn. Whereas it's sort of the inverse here, where we feel Musk has not earned the level of applause and faceness that he's projecting, and we're almost looking to invoke the opposite effect.
Yeah, like the dedication Dom has had for years, right? I was going to bring that up too from your presentation, like the strategies for transcendence, right? Of being able to go from chicken shit to cool, or monster to cool, or any kind of direction, right? It's such a good question, and like, a media psych standpoint, my brain is just like, yeah.
Can I ask a quick one? Yeah. Because I really liked the ideas you brought up and the characterization of Musk as the archetypal chicken shit heel. But my question, or the line of thinking I got into about it, was, is the tech bro overcompensating stereotype a broader expression of that? Because a couple years ago, there was a lot of discourse online about Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk wanting to get into a UFC match. And now they're all running around with chainsaws and getting hair plugs, and they're on steroids because they're trying to, what I interpret as kind of Rogan out to try to jump into that edgelord space. The reason Dominic Mysterio, just in my estimation, eventually got over is because he owned who he was. Sleazy, sort of smarmy background figure who connived his way to the top. And that authenticity is what people eventually use to transcend it. But is there any way that I'm sorry, I'm rambling, and my apologies. So, because authenticity is the cure for uncoolness and it's the gateway to coolness, so long as these tech bros are asserting themselves with this absolute fake masculinity, is there any way for them to transcend without gaining actual self-awareness?
Yeah, that's such a good question, especially in studies of like gender rhetoric right now. There is exactly this question of performative tech bro masculinity and fragility, and how to some extent their expressions of masculinity seem to almost go against the traditional forms that should be expected, especially with like, well, Cecilia, do you want to take this one? You're the gender researcher.
Yeah, so I think it's just sort of interesting in terms of what we think of as the tech bro, right? And it's clearly non-masculine role, but you know, its relationship to incel culture, so on and so forth. And so I think it would be interesting to see what an authentic representation of what Musk conceptualized as masculinity, given he started as maybe a tech bro, right? And putting him into this space. So like I'm not really sure what that would like that level of authenticity would look like for him. Genuinely, just because I'm not sure how authentic he can be as a person, if that makes sense.
Yeah, who knows? And it's such a good point too, AC, about like the Rogan aspect, right? Of just trying to like constantly appeal to him. And that's, you know, part of what I wrote in this last chapter. And it's like, okay, what is Musk gonna start doing now? Like saying he's eating like moose balls to like fill out his back and work his lats, or some stupid, you know, bro snort glutamine or whatever for extra gains. Like who the hell knows? Whatever, you know, this Rogan manosphere incel culture, you know. See, I made you cough and die. I'm sorry. Don't die. You
But
choking on
yeah, I
yourself?
just there's a level of inauthenticity that he has, that he is willing to chase whatever the next trend of what the most masculine people are doing in order to maintain that relevance.
Moose
Um,
balls. That's it. It's moose hearts and moose balls, right, AC? I don't know why I'm asking you to co-sign.
Yeah, I'm gonna need more data and research before I co-sign that. Pardon.
No. There was. Did you have another comment? I forgot.
No, I'm good. I can't find my microphone off button.
You're like, and I can't breathe. We work on that. Get some hot tea and lemon, or a hot toddy. Throw some whiskey in there. Lisa, I mean, we're supposed to be at break right now, but I am happy to keep this going because I know so many of you still have questions and stuff that you want to be able to put in here. So I am of your service. Lisa, I see you did put some questions in there. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask, or you want me to read one of these about the audience performativity again, or
Yeah, I mean, I can throw it in. I'm happy to. Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry I'm late, but it's absolutely wonderful to be here, and I'm so thrilled to see so many people. This is so exciting. I actually had a question just about spontaneity and wrestling audiences, because I think, and it kind of links into authenticity a little bit as well. I know in my research, I argued not necessarily for that in many places. I think that there's a lot more with regards to performativity that audiences are aware of or have practiced into being enough of, that perhaps spontaneity isn't necessarily the thing that's going on, and the same with authenticity. But my question mostly was about performativity in relation to Thunderdome, and particularly thinking about those acts of certain members of the audience that we saw, thinking like the Benoit images, certain videos that were completely offensive, and the nature of the planned obstruction of those videos. They were thrown in there to completely divert what was going on at a time where we did not have that level of audience participatory live in-person culture that would help to mediate those. So I just wanted to throw in that as a kind of musing, mainly for Adam, but also to anyone else who wanted to jump in, about how those in-person regulations of audiences when we're together influence spontaneity and our understanding of it and our perception of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lisa. A great set of questions. I'm just reflecting for a moment on the best way to respond. I think I definitely agree about wrestling audience behavior not necessarily being spontaneous in the everyday sense of the word. I think I was mainly drawing on the way that Bart uses spontaneous to describe how wrestling audiences in the mid-20th century anyway didn't need to be told that it was fiction. It was all done with a nod and a wink without ever ever being explicitly acknowledged. But yeah, I should consider whether that's a misleading way to describe the way that fandom exists now, because obviously, although that was maybe the origins of it, it's really quite frequently acknowledged now. The fact that wrestling is fictional, even during like post pay-per-view press conferences and that kind of thing. And then the points on the Benoit images in the Thunderdome and that kind of antagonism that came through with some of the images and some of the things that happened in the Thunderdome. I've just been saying in the chat that from kind of a discourse theory perspective, I think it's really interesting that WWE audiences in particular seem to rebel against the narrative of the show more often and more intensely during the years in between the closure of WCW and the opening of AEW. So thinking in kind of an Ernesto Laclau terms, it's almost like without an outside to act as a villain, the fans had to find a villain that was internal to WWE, and then you saw that ebb away. That impulse was kind of expressed much less strongly once AEW appeared, and you had this AEW WWE tribalism. Because then at that point, it's like, well, supporting the narrative of the show is itself kind of an implicit antagonistic act towards this unseen villain, which is AEW, like beyond the borders of WWE. So yeah, I find that impulse to kick against an antagonist through wrestling fandom, I think, is really interesting and could be explored a lot further.
Yeah, Melina brought up another good point to that. I don't know if you want to raise it vocally. Where'd you go?
Yeah, sure. About the reality construction part. Because there has been these great observations about wrestling fans always searching for like the real story behind the fake one, and like peeling off all the layers of fictionality. And I think like the structure of wrestling is always antagonistic, right? So this also bleeds into their rhetorics about the reality of wrestling, or what they are searching for in the reality of wrestling. And so I think if there is no real villain, they need to find another real villain. So that's kind of the connection to Adam's point.